Welcome to The Road Home with Jamil Giovanni. When you spend as much time talking about the problems facing young people as I do, whether that's in my book about young men, or this podcast, or the public events that I do on a regular basis, you're often asked, well, what's the solution? How do we help young people? How do we stop this particular social ill from affecting youth? And I think when I'm asked that question, people want or expect some sort of like big new idea they've never heard of before, right? Something bold, something groundbreaking, something that is almost like a new invention or something, right? But the truth is that like a lot of what we need in order to strengthen the supports around young people and steer them in the best direction possible and empower them to lead themselves and their communities and their families, a lot of that is stuff that's already baked into our social fabric, things that we're familiar with, but we need to make stronger or better invest in or enhance, augment, strengthen in some way, right? And that is often what I try to do, is to help people draw their attention to ideas they're already familiar with, things they already know about, but simply need to be almost reintroduced or introduced in a more effective way to young people and to the adults who are charged with supporting them and empowering them. One such idea is mentorship. Right? It's an idea that, as I say it, you probably have a vision of what mentorship looks like in your mind. You've heard of the concept before. You've seen it in action. Maybe you consider yourself to be a mentor. Maybe you've been mentored by others. It's not a new word in our language and in our discourse, and yet it's hard to do well. It's hard to understand at its full capacity. It's hard to standardize so that every young person actually has access to a great high quality mentor. And importantly, it's also hard to sustain a mentorship program or a mentorship culture and ethic because we often take it for granted. When I did my book tour in fall 2018 in Canada and I traveled across the country, I partnered with Big Brothers Big Sisters of Canada for a few reasons. One of which is because they understand mentorship so well. And they've built a model of effective mentorship that is over 100 years old. They've found sustainability. They've found a way of delivering youth services that is relevant across different cultures, geographic spaces, and can be applied to affect different social issues in a different context. And that's why they've been able to survive for over 100 years. I also partnered with them because I wanted people to see that there are solutions locally. Big Brothers Big Sisters, you probably have heard of before, because they have offices all across North America. They are present and visible and well branded. And I think it's important to remind people, someone, for instance, who would come to one of my book events, or someone who downloads this podcast, that there are meaningful organizations in your neighborhood doing work that is important. And that if you think that what I do or the folks who join me on this podcast have important insights about how to make the world a better place, you can also find that in your local neighborhood, because there is a Big Brothers Big Sisters office or other local nonprofits and community leaders who are offering the kinds of programming young people need. So Big Brothers Big Sisters of Canada, for example, is impacting 40,000 youth in over 1,000 communities a year. And that's just in Canada, not even including the United States. And they are effective for a few reasons, but I think a big part of why is because they focus on that individual relationship of giving a young person who might not have a positive role model access to one. And the Boston Consulting Group did a study of the effect that Big Brothers Big Sisters has had on my hometown, Toronto, and found that when looking at the outcomes for young people who grow up in single parent households with a variety of economic and other disadvantages, that the social return on investment is about $18 to $23 for every dollar put into the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. And that the average participant in their program, as he or she grows up, gets older, becomes an adult, has a career, is going to earn on average over $300,000 more than a young person in the same economic circumstances does as they grow up, right? And why that social return on investment is so significant, I believe, is because of how effective that mentor relationship is for people. Regardless of whether it's through the Big Brothers Big Sisters program or somewhere else, mentoring, having a positive example, someone who can give you feedback and talk with you through your challenges and be a role model is incredibly valuable. I've seen it in my personal life, in my professional life, and I'm really happy to shine a light whenever I can on these types of services. And that's what today's episode of the podcast is about. I'll be speaking with Jane Marion, who is the Director of Service Delivery and Community Connections for Big Brothers Big Sisters of Winnipeg. She has also been the National Director of Program Innovation and Research at Big Brothers Big Sisters of Canada. And what we talk about is not only the importance of mentorship and the particular kind of mentorship that Big Brothers Big Sisters offers, but also the different ways we could imagine measuring the effectiveness of a mentor, not just the social return on investment, quantitative approach that I have talked about from that Boston Consulting Group analysis, for example, but also the more qualitative ways of measuring the effect that mentorship has and why that's important. So I hope from this conversation you'll not only get a clearer sense of why Big Brothers Big Sisters is such an important organization across North America, and also in other parts of the world. I'm sure that there are organizations offering similar mentorship services, but also how we talk about the value of these programs, right? And how we get to a point where programs that are having the greatest impact are also appreciated the most. So that when someone like me is asked, hey, how do we solve this problem? And I respond, well, have you thought about mentorship? That people really understand what that means and why it's important. So here's my conversation with Jane. I hope you enjoy it. So Jane, you, in your role, spend a lot of time thinking about the importance of mentorship and its impact. What are your responsibilities here, and how did you get into this work?
So I've been involved in Big Brothers Big Sisters for 17 years now. I started as a caseworker responsible for enrolling volunteers and matching and making the relationships, and then graduated into a management role shortly after that. So I've been doing that for over a decade. I was involved in the Research and Trends Committee in about 2010, where I started to get pretty heavy into thinking about what's actually happening in mentoring relationships, and had the pleasure of going to the Portland Summer Institute on Youth Mentoring in 2010. And then I came back and sort of continued to think about research and how we were understanding the mentoring relationships that we were making. And then for a brief time took a position at the national office in terms of being the Director of Research and Program Innovation. And then I came back to Winnipeg to my role here so I could concentrate on Winnipeg.
And what drew you to Big Brothers Big Sisters as an organization? Why this type of work?
I think at the time I was really young. I was fresh out of conflict resolution studies. As a field, conflict resolution studies was really multidisciplinary. It was picking up little bits of psychology and sociology and philosophy, but it also seemed very practical in terms of working with people's conflicts. I wanted to be a mediator, but particularly I was drawn to relationships and how people work through difficult circumstances to come to shared understandings, and to use conflict as kind of a creative catalyst to change relationships into higher functioning relationships. So in terms of building more peaceable communities, that was really appealing to me. And so the idea of Big Brothers Big Sisters kind of dovetailed into that, where It's relationship based, right? It's people who are actually putting time and energy and commitment into actually building relationships for a purpose, to better our community and to make sure that they're kind of living social justice values.
We, I think, in looking at the lives of young people across Canada and trying to understand what's being done to better support and empower young people, inevitably every conversation comes down to some way of interpreting and understanding evidence, because we're trying to figure out what makes a difference, what's worth funding, what's worth putting your precious time and energy behind as a volunteer. How has, in the course of your career, how has the way we look at evidence evolved and changed? Is it the same, 15 years ago as it is today? Is it different?
I think it's increasingly becoming, as you said, it's competitive in terms of needing evidence in order to qualify for funding opportunities, right? So I think that organizations and programs are using, to borrow a colleague of mine's language, trying to place a better bet by using research to support the practices that they're doing in order to compete for funding. And I think that that's important. I think that there are a lot of grassroots organizations that do incredibly good work. But unless we're really reflecting on our practices, sometimes those practices can actually do harm. For instance, we've learned a lot about match closure in terms of the harm that a negative closure can have on a young person if that relationship is not fully completed, or the mentor abandons the mentee in the relationship. And that knowledge came out of mentoring research by Renee Spencer. And in a way that kind of folds back into our practice, that's huge. But I do think that, so Renee's practice is more qualitative research. I think that as a field, we've gravitated towards more of the quantitative research more and more over the last maybe 10 to 15 years. And that I can sometimes push back against sometimes and be a little skeptical that that's maybe giving us the depth of insight that we might need.
And what do we miss when we just focus on the quantitative side of things?
I think that my skepticism comes from, it's informed by, I guess, post-structural sort of critique of what knowledge is, where we know the epistemology of knowledge. And I think that science played a part in questioning some theories or some ideas that we had that were maybe rooted in religious understandings of the world. And then it tipped so far now into like very positive research, is the science that everybody is saying is that we should be revering. And I think that in some cases, we just can't reduce human beings and human relationships down to numbers and really know what it is that we are interpreting when we look at those numbers, right? So we're always interpreting not just words and language and all of the sensory data around us, but we are interpreting even those data sets. And sometimes you can put two researchers in the same room and they will give you two very different interpretations of what that data set is telling you. So I think that it plays a part. I think that it gives us knowledge that we can then critique, but I find that my own sense is that we shouldn't just sort of rest, that there's no sense of the end, and that science was never intended to be conclusive, right? It's intended to pose ideas and open up conversations and give us more information to go on.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is that you need a kind of a balance of both, and moving too far in one direction leaves some important things out. I actually feel like a lot of the time in the work I do around, let's say, gun violence, I feel like it's the opposite in Canada. It's a lot of qualitative and no quantitative. So I feel the exact same way. It's like, it's not that I'm saying qualitative isn't important, just like you're not saying quantitative is important. It's, you got to have both, because both are teaching you something. Absolutely. Right? So this shift towards quantitative evaluation of mentoring programs and youth programs, how is that being challenged? Is there an alternative way of explaining the impact and the efficacy of your work that you found to be helpful?
I have really turned to what's sometimes known as appreciative inquiry or narrative inquiry in terms of those particular, they would be more qualitative forms of inquiry. And it really is centered around trying to understand that individuals are the best experts on their own experiences, and that you can always drill down meaning more and more in deconstructing what language means and what an experience means. So in a quantitative way, we would give somebody a survey and they would write down, you know, I'm going to rate my relationship between 1 and 5 in terms of how safe I feel. Well, that's going to give me some information, but when they mark down that they feel 5 out of 5 safe, I actually want to know more about that. What does safety mean to you? What do you mean that your relationship feels safe to you? What's actually, right, contained in the word safe? For me, that's going to give me more information to build better programs and better mentor training and give better coaching, and just to better understand the experiences that we're actually producing when we make these relationships. So,
how would you define narrative inquiry for someone who's never heard that term before? What does it constitute?
So narrative theory, most people are familiar in terms of literature, right? Or in terms of you read a story, and we sometimes have a common sense understanding that when you produce a story that it doesn't just mean one thing, and that many people reading that, multiple readers, will all have their subjective understanding of what that particular text means. And so narrative theory sort of takes that and maps it over to individuals and human experiences and human relationships, and says, we're all stories. We're all made up of multiple stories. Our relationship is a story. You have a story. We're putting a story together right now. And we can all understand that differently. But that there are some dominant themes. So narrative theory would also say there are certain types of stories. Some of these stories are shared, and some of these stories are common, and some of the stories that we tell are perhaps what they'd call subjugated. They're really not heard. They're not listened to. They're not amplified. They might even be repressed, right? So we have these dominant narratives. Narratives about what masculinity means, what a narrative around femininity means, our narratives around race, our narratives around that we pull in through discourse, right? That the discourse shapes our understanding of ourselves through our interplay with those dominant stories, right? So we don't just create those stories ourselves. We're always in relationship with the dominant discourse around us that is feeding us these ideas and these thoughts through media and song and literature and the news and all of those bits of the way that we talk about experiences form this sort of collective understanding of meaning in a lot of ways, right? And so I'm particularly interested in wanting to find out individuals' meaning and how that sort of is taken up in terms of the dominant narratives around us.
You know, taking those premises, right, that, you know, that life is made up of many narratives and every person has an understanding of their own experience and their own kind of journey that they're going through, that they're undergoing. How does that interact with your work then? So if someone were to say, I'm going to take a narrative inquiry approach to mentoring, what does that look like in practice?
So in terms of, I think when I think about it in terms of one of the narrative therapists that I turn to frequently, who talks about all of the sum of one's life experiences plot this very chaotic kind of path in terms of, right, we have a scattering of all sorts of different experiences in different times and places and settings and contexts and relationships. And what we do when we narrate a story is we take little evidence from little bits of that and manufacture the story of our experience by kind of pulling together all of these past examples. So to tell a problem-saturated story, we're going to look to all the evidence that we have that tells us that either, right, I'm a bad person. I can give you countless examples of times that I've messed up, or that I've been told that I'm a bad person, or that I've experienced myself as bad. And I can tell that story of a bad person. But I could also tell you a story of a good person, because I can also go back and find a whole lot of evidence to the contrary, right? I can find evidence to tell you why I'm a good person too. And so we often talk about that as being the counter story to the problem story. So when a parent brings in a child, sometimes their families can be saturated with a problem story. They can be putting that child in our program because there's a problem, right? There's a problem with Jim. He's got no self-confidence. He's got no self-esteem. He's acting out at school. And then in the relationship with the mentor, we can actually understand that they're actually being recontextualized, because that mentor is not going to understand that boy the same way as his parents understand. And they can take a highlighter, right? And they can just start hunting for all of those good examples to construct that counter story of why that young person actually is either a worthy person or a confident person, or looking at all of these strengths and virtues and talents and aspects of self that need to be extracted from the history and really mirrored back to them to construct that idea of, I don't see you as a bad kid. I don't see you as a stupid kid. I don't see you as a weak person, right? And they do that not by constructing their own story with no evidence, but through dialogue and getting to know that young person. They're actually inspecting their history through questions, right? Through dialogue, because that's how we know one another. So if the mentors are really skilled in what they do, they could be doing that so well, or they could be missing entire opportunities to do that with a young person by perhaps not being so either aware of or skilled in those kind of micro dialogical processes where they could really be really beneficial, or even more beneficial.
I can think of so many examples of young people and older people who would benefit from trying to almost like re-understand themselves, right? Mm-hmm. To say, like, could I look at my life in a more empowering or positive way? Could I be kinder to myself? Mm-hmm. Could I treat myself like someone I care about and want to help? Give myself the same benefit of the doubt I give to people that I love, right? Yeah. And I think that narrative approach makes a lot of intuitive sense. What I see as a potential, I guess, way that it could go sideways is if recognizing the individual narratives that we all have essentially becomes a way for us to not have things in common, right? So if we focus so much on the uniqueness of our narrative, then we might miss where our narratives kind of intersect, right? And that's where I could imagine, let's say you have a mentor who thinks he or she couldn't help a kid, or couldn't relate to a kid, or couldn't build a connection because in their mind, their narrative is so different that what could I possibly do to help you? That, I guess, perspective that a mentor needs to have in order to feel like they can make that difference. What is that? Like, how do you build that, I guess, like confidence, right? Because I'm sure you could think of examples where a mentor says, I'm so different from that kid. What could I do for him? Or what could I do for her?
I think that would come into play, and I think we all do it because we have a tendency to be really reductive in language, especially in labeling kids, right? So even the construct of race, if you take a mentor and you say this young person does not share the same racial identity as you do, different ethnic background, they might just all of a sudden take that construct or that label, and they're just putting their own meaning and assumptions and whatever they think that means into play in a very distancing way. But if we can encourage people to actually just stay in that maybe place of discomfort and actually unpack a little bit more who that individual person is. I think that what that does is it gives a more rich understanding of the individual, which is actually more entry points to empathy. They might actually be able to then broaden the category of that individual to be a person who actually really likes basketball, and a person who maybe has experienced a parent dealing with addiction, or there's all sorts of then micro labels inside of that one's distancing label that might be an entry point, that might be a place where we can even start to scaffold some connection. So I think, if we just use labels, they're always going to be distancing because we're packing them in with our own meaning.
So what do you say to someone who, let's say, is a white person who wants to be a mentor and says, I don't think I could mentor a Black child because we don't have enough in common? Mm-hmm. Or, a Chinese Canadian who wants to be a mentor and says, well, maybe I couldn't connect with an Indigenous child because we don't have enough in common. Is that a problem you observe? And if so, how do you overcome those assumptions?
I think it is a problem. And I think that part of it, I think it's twofold. I think that people assume that they're supposed to be, as an adult in an adult-child relationship, the expert, right? So that's, again, a classic sort of understanding of power in relationships. And we do know that adults hold more social power and responsibility in those relationships than the children. It's always unequal. But I think that really good relational work that can be a little bit more transformational helps elevate that young person into more of the expert, right? So if a mentor is not thinking about themselves as that sage, wise, I have to help this child understand all the ways that they need to understand how to become an adult, they're decentering their own wisdom and they're elevating that child. And all that takes then is curiosity. Asking questions and demonstrating a sincere interest in being able to really understand how that person has walked their walk to that point in time is all about becoming a good investigator in terms of questions, right? So they don't have to have the answers. You don't have to be the white person who's connecting with the Black person in some sort of shared experience even. They just need to be inquisitive enough to really try and understand what that means to that young person at the time, right? And I think that we do a poor job of being really interested in the other. I think that we tend to be, through society, conditioned to be pretty self-interested and to think that we have to be the ones with all the answers and all the skills and all the abilities, and we're going to show this less experienced person how to be elevated in some domain. And I actually don't think that that's all that the mentoring relationships can be. I think that the gift that you can give a young person by actually seeing them as an expert in their own experiences and with their own sort of sense of self and where that's come from, that's huge for kids, right? Tell me more about what that means to you. Where did you learn that idea? Where do you think that came from? Sometimes I ask my daughter through just, my work, I end up coming up with questions like, what is that show teaching you about what society thinks about women? If we think about things that way and we're actually curious to know how children are making meaning for themselves, that's huge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a foundational element to what you're describing is dialogue, right? Mm-hmm. And, I'm a very big believer in honest conversation and humble conversation because of that. And it always bothers me when people, I guess, put up barriers to communication, right? Like, oh, I feel like I can't say something, or I can't be wrong, or I can't openly admit my ignorance or my lack of experience. It's just I think we all get better off at the end when we say, through conversation, we'll better understand each other. And you know what? The end of a conversation is supposed to be better than the beginning, right? It might start off where you're uncomfortable, as you described, or you simply are ignorant and you say the wrong thing, or you're not at your best. But the hope is that, by the end of a conversation, you learn something, you take something away. And that only comes from having that, I think, confidence that dialogue can achieve something for us. So in this discussion, the term expert or expertise has come up. And I find it perhaps a little bit ironic, because when I hear you talk, I think she's an expert on these issues, right? Like I'm going to call you one, even if you don't accept the label. And the reason I say that is because we do need people in our societies who focus enough on kind of niche areas that they can help inform the scaling up of good ideas, right? Who understand enough about mentorship, for example, that they can build really good programs that affect lots of families and children. And I think that you've spent the time thinking about this in a way where I would say, okay, this is someone who can offer a lot to others by, listening. What that means, though, is we have to be comfortable with expertise to some extent, right? Because if there's no expertise, then when there's a good idea, we don't know what to do with it, because we haven't really identified where we get the good idea and distinguish it from the not as good idea. How do you reconcile that? How do you think about that? Like, how do we identify best practices and promote best practice, but at the same time say we're not going to stifle other people's voices or stories?
I wrestle with it. I think it's one of the more challenging aspects of where I've come to in my career. I am a reader. I am a studier. I am very comfortable just sitting and reading and putting these theories together. And I tend to bring a lot of theories together in ways that don't naturally make sense to some people sometimes. And it's hard to translate an idea into practice with people who don't necessarily have all of those little bits and pieces to put together, because it's difficult to know where to start. And so I find it hard to communicate sometimes my ideas about where we could be strengthening practice, because it takes so much time with somebody in dialogue, in conversation, in work, in relationship, to kind of really make sure that you're translating your idea in a way where you're allowing for that uptake to not just feel like you're just, right, in a top-down way, forcing your idea on someone, right? I've come to this really great conclusion and you're going to make it happen for me. I think that the people on the ground, the caseworkers that are in relationship with the volunteers, they really need to live and understand the why behind their practices, and they need to believe as strongly as I believe in the power of dialogue. And if they don't, then someone coming in and saying, you need to just read a book on narrative practice and then do casework totally differently, just doesn't work.
I think that makes sense, but I also worry when there's like an uptick in violence, for example. And, all of a sudden governments remember that there's crime and, they start to write checks to programs, and over again in cities in Europe, in the United States and Canada, I've seen that process happen in ways that are kind of shocking, quite honestly, because there's such little effort put into understanding what makes a successful intervention. And so I see these like millions of dollars being spent, and so much of it seems like it's money being spent on who's familiar, who's safe to give money to, who maybe might intuitively make sense for a newspaper story. But when you ask and you try to dig and say, okay, how do you know that program is helping the kids that need the help, right? The kids who might actually join a gang or become a drug dealer, or the kids who are coming out of the justice system. There's such little evidence often for how that's reaching the people most in need. And so I feel that tension in the sense of, I want to be able to distinguish what works from what doesn't. I want to be able to distinguish the good ideas from the not as good. And yet at the same time, I also don't want to turn social services into some kind of, empirically driven, technocratic exercise where everything is an Excel spreadsheet and there's not space for the narratives you're describing. That is not an easy balance to figure out, but I'm going to be unfair and ask you how you would advise someone listening to think about that. Do you have any suggestions for how we reconcile these kind of competing interests and goals in our minds?
So in my mind, capitalism changes everything when it comes to evaluation of programs. So if we were not so embedded in all of our administration and bureaucracies and ways of managing money, and if we didn't have to deal with all of that and we could actually just concentrate on what we could put together in terms of a very robust mixed method evaluation, I think you could totally do it. I think we get mired in all of the other administrative technicalities that come into play when managing large sums of money. And I think sometimes we have a tendency, because we are competitive, to overpromise what we can actually provide as service delivery folks. I think small-scale evaluations and proper small-scale evaluations would be so much more effective than promising that you can evaluate thousands of people in these meta-analyses that are being conducted. But they're not as attractive, right? They're just not as people.
In terms of fundraising and stuff,
in terms of what the funders are looking for, they're looking for, large numbers of children or youth to participate in these surveys, and I think they fail because they're overcomplicated.
And is that because there's not, I guess, a confidence that being surgical is going to work, or is it just not? We just chase big numbers and that is just kind of how we're hardwired, and so it always sounds more exciting to hear 10,000 than 100, right?
Yep, I think that's part of it. And I think that people are reticent to speak back to funders, to actually educate them and say, realistically, it would be better for us to do it this way. And there is some confidence there to actually be able to present expertise and say, this is the way, like this is the better way to do this, right? And it's not as many, and it might be more costly even, but this will produce better results. I think that people are I mean, realistically, we are all competing within capitalism, and nobody wants to shy away from money. Nobody wants to turn down money, and nobody wants to lose money, right? So it becomes, I think, unfortunately, we do end up getting competitive, and that ends up taking us into areas where it pulls us away from the quality of our work.
Yeah, I don't know how much of it is capitalism in a free sense, like the free market, because part of what I see is that when so much of the money comes from the government, that you wind up with like one kind of cultural around fundraising or funding and grants and all that kind of dominating a sector. So when the government has a priority, it's like organizations run to that priority, and a more diversified, way of funding the work we do, I feel would make more of a difference in creating some of that space for, like, maybe you get one funder that really likes what you just described in terms of the small scale, deep analysis that could then lead to bigger initiatives. And then another funder likes the big numbers, and another funder says, I really want to try new things. And then another funder says, I only want to try things that have a long track record, right? Like, if you had this mix of, like, a diversity of views on this, I think it would make for a better landscape. And I get frustrated that, like, literally every city I go into, it's like everyone's complaining that the government either, is not giving enough, or they're giving less or more or whatever. And I feel like having kind of one group have that much power is almost always not good, right? And especially with the broad range of issues that social service organizations have to tackle.
The second thing that I think happens, and I totally agree with you, is that people rush to impact evaluation instead of doing feasibility analysis ahead of time, right?
What's the distinction?
So in the impact study, you are literally testing impact, but programs will pilot a program. So it's a brand new approach. They're going to put together this thing that they don't do and immediately test impact. And unfortunately, when it comes to mentoring, they're human relationships. They also depend on how many people are going to come through the door to be mentors. The predictability and foreseeability of numbers is really difficult. And when we're trying to serve the kids that need it the most, we're actually looking for, right, even a harder to match sometimes pool of youth. So I think that when there's new programming that is a great idea because the need is there, or there's a demographic who we want to serve and we want to see how that works, we first need to see if the program model is feasible. We first need to see if we can even get market penetration for the mentors. We first need to see if the caseworkers have the skills and the ability and the training to be able to do the work. And then once you get the program going, that's when you put the quantitative or qualitative analysis in place to actually test how it's actually operating for those individual participants. But what I see kind of time and time again is it's all at the beginning. You need to start the program, get the people, and test the impact kind of all at once. And I think that's it's fraught.
What do you see as the kind of medium and long-term future of this kind of work? Do you know, I hear sometimes about e-mentoring or you know, that the trying to find ways of reaching more people with fewer resources. And I don't know if that's where this goes next or what you see as the future of mentoring, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, or you know, as best as possible, putting on your prediction hat, what you think comes next.
Well, to be honest, what I've seen so far is very scary to me. It's very alarming in the sense that I think that people are looking for those large numbers. And so moving to group mentoring models is certainly the flavor of the day. And in some cases, and sometimes with the right kids, group mentoring is the right intervention. And so it's not to say that group mentoring is always just the fast food approach to mentoring. It absolutely serves a purpose for particular kids in particular situations. But I think that we're seeing a slow decline of our community-based one-to-one long-term programs based on the number of people who are willing to step up and be mentors, and it alarms me. And I don't know whether it's a reaction to other social factors that are keeping us more isolated. Again, I would still say capitalism's keeping us so busy and occupied with ways of getting money and spending money and mass consumer, approaches to living, that we are so pulled apart from our relationships with one another. And I think what we do is actually quite political in the sense that it is really focused on relationships. One of my favorite philosophers, Todd May, talks about friendships as a resistance to this type of mindset in terms of this overly consumed, hyper-individualistic model of living life. And those pivotal social contacts that we have with people are just so important for not only for our own individual health, but for the health of our communities. So when I start to see declines in people willing to actually have relationships and tight, long-term, intense relationships with one another, I start to get really concerned for the health of obviously our cities and our countries. That's when I do think that violence escalates, when we start to become so pulled apart from one another, and do see relationship building as a very important method of intervention and community building.
To learn more about Big Brothers Big Sisters and their mentorship services, visit their website, bigbrothersbigsisters.ca, or follow them on Twitter at BBBSC. Thank you for listening.